On a warm summer's night in 1912, 8 people were viciously bludgeoned to death in their home in Villisca, Iowa, leaving many unanswered questions as to why such atrocities could happen, and even more frightening, who had carried out the horrific crimes. With the murderer or murderers still unknown to this day, 110 years later and still being left with no concrete answers, the Villisca Axe Murders are considered one of America's most disturbing unsolved crimes of all time. Due to the immensely graphic nature of the murders that will be discussed, listener discretion is strongly advised. Welcome back to Rogue Darkness, the podcast that uncovers how the misinterpretations and misinformation surrounding witchcraft, the occult, and other beliefs have led many to do unthinkable crimes. From ritualistic killings and the demons that live in all of us, to exploration of the macabre and delving deep into the unknown. Let's explore the darkness of mankind, one crime at a time. I'm your host of The Grim and Gruesome, Raven. Let's go rogue and get right into today's chilling crime, the case of the Villisca Axe Murders, and how the exact perpetrator of such crimes is still unknown to this day. So now, let's start off from the very beginning. Villisca, a city in Montgomery County, Iowa, has a population of just over 1,000 people and is best known for the unsolved axe murders of the Moore family back in the summer of 1912. The Moore family consisted of Josiah, who was oftentimes referred to as Joe, his wife, Sarah Montgomery Moore, and their 4 children, Herman Montgomery, Mary Catherine, Arthur Boyd, and Paul Vernon. On June 9, 1912, Mary Catherine invited her friends, 2 sisters named Ina May and Lena Gertrude Stillinger, to a sleepover at her house. That same day, the Moores all went to their local Presbyterian church, where the children took part in the Children's Day program, and Sarah was the co-director who had initially put the program together. The church service lasted until around 9:30 p.m., and they all then walked 3 blocks back home, arriving to the house between 9:45 and 10 p.m. The next morning, on June 10th, around 7:30 a.m., Mary Peckham, a neighbor, noticed that the house was completely and eerily silent, with not a soul in sight. Mary walked up to the house and knocked on the door but received no response, so she attempted to open the door, but it was locked. Mary let the family's chickens out and then called Josiah's brother, Ross Moore, to see if maybe the family had gone somewhere early in the morning, as it seemed out of the ordinary as the Moore family was usually up and lively at that hour. Ross arrived at the house around 8 a.m., knocked on the door, and tried yelling in hopes that someone in the house would hear him and open the door. When that didn't work, he used his copy of the key to unlock the front door. Ross entered the house, and upon opening the guest bedroom door, he was met with a horrific sight: the lifeless bodies of Ina and Lena Stillinger. They had been bludgeoned to death with what would later be determined to be an axe. Shocked at the horrific sight he had just discovered, Ross ran to the phone and called Joe's hardware store to speak with Hank Horton, as Hank was the primary peace officer in Villisca at that time. Arriving at the home, Hank cautiously walked through the house to see if anyone else was there, and that's when he came across the entire Moore family, brutally murdered, bludgeoned to death, just as the Stillinger sisters had been. Exiting the house, Hank told Ross that he saw someone murdered in every bed within the home. The murder weapon found at the scene, an axe, had actually belonged to Josiah and was partially cleaned and leaning against the downstairs bedroom wall where the Stillinger sisters had been discovered. The murders, according to police and medical examiners, occurred between midnight and 5 a.m. It was determined that the murderer began their killing spree beginning in the master bedroom, where Josiah and Sarah slept. The axe had reportedly swung so high in the ceiling that it had created a hole above their bed. Josiah had been hit with the axe at least 30 times, the most out of all the victims. His head had been so badly shattered that his eyes were even missing. The axe was then used to bludgeon everyone within the home to death. After killing all of the Moore children, the murderer then returned to Josiah and Sarah's room, where they then inflicted even more blows. After the entirety of the Moore family had been bludgeoned to death, the murderer then made their final stop, the guest bedroom where the two sisters Lena and Ina slept, not aware that their friendly sleepover would ultimately end in such a horrific way. Reports stated that the killer had performed some sort of ritual, covering the Moore parents' heads with sheets and covering the Moore children's faces with clothing. The killer then went through the entire house, covering every mirror and window with clothes and towels. They then took a 4-pound piece of uncooked bacon from the refrigerator and leaned it against the wall right next to the axe. Upon investigating the crime scene, a plate of uneaten food remained on the kitchen table alongside a bowl of bloody water, the bowl being what the police believed was from the killer washing their hands. The police believed that Lena Stillinger was the only person awake during the murders, as her body had defensive wounds on her knee and arm, indicating a struggle. Lena's nightgown had been pushed up to her waist, and she was found with no undergarments on. However, upon closer inspection, the doctor said she had not been sexually assaulted. Accumulating a pretty lengthy suspect list, the police worked their way through their suspects over time. The first on their list was a man named Frank Jones, a local businessman, who was in competition with Josiah Moore. Josiah had reportedly worked with farm equipment for 7 years before Josiah ended up leaving Frank's company to start his own business. There had even been some rumors going around that Josiah was having an affair with Frank's daughter-in-law, but there was ultimately no proof to back up such claims. People in town had said that the two families disliked each other, that they were rivals, but they never believed the dislike was enough to lead to murder. The next suspect on the list was George Kelly, an English minister who immigrated to the United States with his wife in 1904 and who had preached at Methodist churches in North Dakota, Minnesota, Kansas, and Iowa. George had a history of sexual deviance as well as mental health issues, and he was once accused of asking young women and girls to pose nude for him. George had gone to Villisca on June 8th to teach at the Children's Day program, which the Moore family attended the next day on June 9th. George had left town between 5 and 5:50 a.m. on June 10th, hours before the bodies were even discovered, making it possible for him to have killed the family, then fled the scene. George was also left-handed, and police determined that the blood spatters came from a left-handed person, another damning piece of evidence that could potentially point to him as being the murderer. Many people claim that George was always keeping an eye on the Moore family while they were at church, or even almost stalking them while they were out and about in town. A local dry cleaner had come forward stating that they received bloody clothes from George a few days after the murders, asking for them to clean the stains. According to reports, George had even pretended to be a detective and had asked the police to get access to the house after the murders. Why he would need access to their home left a bad taste in many people's mouths and made him all the more suspicious. To make him appear even more guilty, George Kelly had allegedly told people he was traveling with that there were 8 dead souls back in Villisca, Iowa, and that they were butchered in their sleep at 5:19 a.m., the morning after the murders, on June 10th. The strange thing about his claim was that the bodies were not discovered until closer to 8:30 a.m., making it very plausible that he had murdered them around 5 a.m., then left town, giving him enough time to escape before the bodies would be discovered. George was not arrested for the murders, but did end up getting arrested in 1914, 2 years after the murders, for sexually harassing a woman who had applied for a job as his secretary. Instead of imprisoning him, though, George was sent to St. Elizabeth's Hospital, a mental hospital in Washington, D.C., where he was hoped to be rehabilitated from his shameful ways. George Kelly ended up signing a confession to the murders on August 31st, 1917, saying that God had spoken to him and told him that, "Suffer the children to come unto me." Despite the confession, though, while at his trial, George recanted the confession, and the jury ended up being deadlocked 11-1, and he was then acquitted on September 26th. As a result, a second trial was then held, and George Kelly was acquitted once again in November of that same year. Although there was compelling information that made it appear that George was in fact the murderer, there was one more man that was on the suspect list, a man named William Mansfield. Similar murder cases had taken place in Colorado Springs, Colorado, Ellsworth, Kansas, and Palo, Kansas, just 9 months before the Villisca murders, and the murders in Colorado Springs were eerily similar to those of the Moore family, and that authorities tied back to William. A family had been discovered mercilessly slaughtered with an axe. The windows within their home had been covered with bed sheets. The blood was wiped off of the axe, and all of the victims' heads were covered, just like with the Moore family. Detective James Wilkinson of Kansas City believed that William had actually been the one responsible for the murders of his own wife, infant child, as well as his father and mother-in-law on July 5, 1914, in Blue Island, Illinois, 2 years after the Villisca murders had taken place. The axe murders reported in Palo, Kansas, had also occurred just 4 days prior to the murders in Villisca, making them not only eerily similar in the manner of the crime, but also in close proximity to one another. According to Detective Wilkinson, all the murders were committed in the same way, implying that they were most likely committed by the same person, who he believed to be William Mansfield. In 1916, an investigation was launched with numerous pieces of incriminating links presumably tying William to each of the crimes, and based off of the police findings, William was then arrested and transported from Kansas City to Montgomery County, Iowa. Payroll records from his employer, however, provided William with a solid alibi, despite authorities leaning towards him as being the perpetrator. The records providing that he was in Illinois at the time of the Villisca murders, and from this, he was released and rewarded $2,000, which is about $56,000 in today's currency. Even after years of investigation and looking into every possible scenario regarding the axe murders, the authorities' efforts unfortunately resulted in no definitive answers as to who the axe murderer was, or why the crimes were committed in the first place. There are many unanswered questions still lingering to this day regarding the Moore family murders, such as whether it was a single random attack. Was it a serial killer's work? Possibly a traveling killer? Or maybe it could have been a local perpetrator, picking off individuals that they deemed as easy prey. Despite the fact that many axe murders had occurred at family homes during the same time period, no additional links have ever been made. The case eventually went cold, and no one had wanted to buy or even renovate the house since the brutal slayings. The Villisca Axe Murder House now operates as a paranormal hotel and tourist attraction, where groups of 6 can pay to stay the night. While the house remains on the same quiet road all these years later, with generations continuing to pass down the story of the horrific Villisca Axe murders, 110 years later, and still, unfortunately, no one knows what actually happened on June 10th, 1912, and it will likely remain a grim mystery for many more years to come. So that was the case of the infamous Villisca Axe murders, and how the gruesome crime left its mysterious and macabre mark in history, with many speculations and unanswered questions still circulating to this day. Definitely let me know your thoughts on this case, and if you have any questions regarding it or any other cases I've covered, feel free to contact me at roguedarknesspod@gmail.com. You can also always reach out to me on my socials, Instagram and Twitter at rogue_darkness, on my website, roguedarkness.com, or follow me over on my YouTube channel and TikTok for a whole new perspective on the pod. It'd be awesome if you could share the podcast with anyone who you think would like it, and leave a rating and review on Apple iTunes, Spotify, or any other platform where you can do so to let other listeners know you enjoy the show. As mentioned, I do currently have a sticker giveaway going on for anyone who leaves a review on Apple Podcasts or on Spotify. And all you have to do is take a screenshot of that review, send it my way, and then I'll send you some stickers. And if you want some personalized shoutouts and other exclusives, definitely check out my Patreon by visiting patreon.com/roguedarkness. You can also check out my Bonfire shop if you want to get your hands on some merch to support the show even further. For references and additional information on the cases covered, you can find all of the links for everything discussed in my episodes down in the description box. And with that said, that concludes this week's episode of Rogue Darkness. The darkness is all around us, and I can confidently say that reality truly is more terrifying than fiction. Until next time.